Hello, everyone. My name is Professor Vincent Canato, and I am a professor of history at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. And I teach U.S. history, 20th century U.S. history there. And today I want to talk to you about the 1970s. The 1960s usually gets a lot of attention. It's kind of the more glamorous of the decades, but I've long believed that the 1970s is a far more interesting decade. And in the last year or two, I think that the 1970s has taken on a kind of a new relevancy, so to speak. So today I'm going to talk to you about the 1970s, America in the 1970s, and we're going to be drawing parallels between the 1970s and today. So as we go along and we talk about the 70s, we'll also kind of be talking about things today. So I think as you learn about the history of the 70s, you'll be saying, wow, that sounds awfully familiar. We sometimes call the 1970s the age of limits. This comes after the great post-war economic boom from the mid-1940s down to the late 1960s. And one thing that symbolizes the age of limits is oil, gas. So here we have two photos on the bottom from the mid-70s of the gas shortage. Many of you might remember the gas shortages, the gas lines. I remember as a little boy the gas lines being in line with my father to get gas. And on top is a recent photo, I believe from out in California, with gas prices over $6. So both of these periods, whether it's today or the 1970s, we're often talking about the limits of economic growth, the limits of natural resources like oil, the limits of what America can do as a world power. So that's a sort of a good phrase to sum up the 1970s, and for better and for worse, I think it also sums up where we are today. Now, 1970s versus the 2020s. Inflation, a stagnant economy, rising energy prices, embarrassing withdrawal from a foreign war, presidential scandals, declining faith in institutions. All of these are themes from America in the 1970s, but I think they all hold true for today. We're not wearing bell bottoms or polyester leisure suits. You see here we've got Donny Osmond and the Osmonds, the famous band from the 1970s. So we're not wearing these outrageous suits today, but boy, I think there are a lot of parallels between the 1970s and our own time. And if you didn't think that was enough, how about some more parallels? Battles over abortion, affirmative action, increasing crime and urban disorder, American population moving from the Northeast and the Midwest down to the South and Southwest. How about international affairs? How about Russia invading one of its neighbors and causing an international crisis? And then lastly, a general feeling of malaise about the country. Malaise is a great word. I think if you don't know what it means, I would say malaise is kind of like the blahs, right? This feeling, it's the opposite of optimism. Not quite pessimism, but just a feeling that things are not going well. Things are not going right. So all of this, as I said, defines the 1970s, but it certainly all of these sound like what we're going through today. So before we talk about the 70s, we kind of have to talk about what came before, this era of post-war consensus and prosperity. So America and its allies were victorious in World War II, had defeated the Axis powers on two fronts, on both in Europe and the Pacific, this sort of great victory. And after the victory, troops come home, and beginning around the mid to late 1940s, we begin to get an era of economic prosperity from about the mid to late 40s down to the late 1960s. So about a little over 20 years of economic prosperity. There were a couple of dips, a couple of small recessions in there, but by and large, we had a vast increase in national wealth. And it was national wealth that didn't all go to the top. It helped to sort of build a very broad-based middle class. This was the era of strong unions, the peak unionization in America at the time. big business and unions sort of worked together to kind of share this prosperity. We had I Like Ike, right? Eisenhower, one of the great victorious generals of World War II, becomes the symbol of this period as a two-term president. We have the rise of suburbia, mass housing in the suburbs for the middle class. We have a baby boom. We have a tremendous boom in the number of children that are born between 1947 and 1964. All of that, I think, is symbolic of a great period of optimism. Right? America had been victorious in the war. Now, all of a sudden, we have this booming economy. We're out of the Great Depression, out of the doldrums of the 30s. Things are looking up. Yes, it's a Cold War going on with Russia. There's some fears about nuclear weapons. But on the whole, Americans are generally fairly optimistic about where things are headed. And as kind of a capstone to that great optimism is the landing of the astronauts on the moon, the success of the Apollo missions. That's sort of the peak of America's post-war prosperity, technological progress. And then in the late 1960s, I think it all kind of comes apart. One of the things that happens at home is inflation. We have here on the right, this is from food protests, housewives protesting rising cost of food in the late 1960s. Inflation begins creeping up in the late 1960s. It's going to take off in the 1970s. It's going to hit 11% in 1974. It'll go back down a little bit, and then by 79, 80, it's going to get back up to 14%. To give you a sense of today, we're somewhere between 8 and 9% inflation. What caused this inflation? There's a lot of reasons, and economists sort of debate this. One of the reasons, a couple of the reasons, one is the increase in government spending on both the Great Society and the Vietnam War. And we see in our own time the increased spending both in sort of pandemic aid as well as kind of the recent budgets under Biden. You also have more kind of money in circulation. There was, I read something recently where almost half of all dollars out there now were printed in the last couple of years. The rising cost of oil, which we'll talk about in a second, also has inflationary pressures. So the question is, why is inflation bad? It's not completely bad. There's always going to be a little bit, usually a little bit of inflation. The opposite of inflation is deflation, and deflation has its own problems. But when you think about inflation, what inflation really means is that the dollar bill that you hold today is going to be worth less tomorrow. Now, over 20 or 30 years, yes, that's going to happen. But when it happens within a matter of months or years, people start to lose faith in the currency, in the money. To give you one of the most famous historical examples, 1920s, 30s Weimar Germany, before the Nazis take over, was a period of hyperinflation, where the Deutschmark is tremendously devalued. There's a wonderful photo, there's a very, I don't say wonderful, but there's a photo of someone in 1930s Germany with Deutschmarks in a wheelbarrow to go shopping, because the value of the German currency was increasingly worthless. If you go to work this week and you get paid on Friday, you kind of know what you're getting, right? But if next week you get paid the same amount, but it's worth less, wow, that's a lot. And that's what happens in periods of hyperinflation. The inflation rate goes up 50, 60, 100%. More recently, countries like Zimbabwe and Argentina had inflation rates in the hundreds, if not thousands of percent. This is incredibly destabilizing to a country, and this is one reason that inflation is a problem. Inflation can be good for some people. It's good for borrowers. If you're borrowing money, let's say you borrow money now and you have inflation over the next couple of years, the money that you're going to be paying back on that debt is going to be worth less, right? So that's good. You'll be paying less money, the same amount, but it won't be worth as much. So there is some sense that inflation is good for debtors. But overall, it's fairly destabilizing, and it increases the cost to households of food, of basic services, and wages rarely are able to keep up with inflation. So this is the issue with inflation, whether the 70s or today. In addition to the inflation, you had a number of economic recessions in America at this time. I would argue that the period of post-war prosperity ends in 1969, 1970. It's a minor recession, it's a pretty small recession. It hits New York City very hard. New York City never really recovers from that. The rest of the country recovers from it, but gets hit again with a major recession in 1973 to 1975. And that's largely due to what we'll talk about in a second, the oil crisis. And then we have another major recession from 1979 to 1982, which is caused by an attempt to squeeze out the inflation from the economy, which we'll mention later in the lecture. In addition to inflation, we have something called stagflation, stagnant economy plus inflation. Traditional Keynesian economics said that inflation and unemployment would go in opposite directions. When you had high inflation, you would usually have low unemployment. When you had high unemployment, you would have low inflation. But in the 1970s, we have high inflation with high unemployment and low rates of economic growth. That is the stagflation of the 70s. Today, there's some debate whether we're in a recession or not. We've had two quarters of negative economic growth, although the job report is still, employment is still relatively strong. But I think we are, if we're not in a recession now, we will probably, everyone agrees that in the next few months we'll be headed for one. And if we have high inflation and a recession, we can welcome back stagflation again. In addition to this, the stock market is stagnant for over a decade. By 1968, it was around 1,000, and then in 1980, the Dow Jones average was about 1,000 as well. It did not go, it sort of went up and down within that range, but it stayed relatively flat. We have, in the last 30 or so years, if you have retirement money invested in the stock market, you know the market has gone up tremendously. If the Dow was 1,000 in 1980, it's about 30,000 today. So that gives you a sense of how much in 40 years the Dow Jones, the stock market, has grown. But there's tremendous fear that moving forward, we might be heading back to the 1970s with the stock market as well, where basically the market is going to be flat for the next few years, if not longer. And that's one of the great fears. The issue of oil and energy are central to the problems of the 1970s. Most famously, the OPEC oil embargo. OPEC are the union of a cartel of mostly Middle Eastern, Nigeria is part of Venezuela, the oil producers of the Middle East and other countries. To punish the U.S. for its support of Israel in the Yom Kippur War, the OPEC reduces oil production. Reducing oil production is going to boost the price of gas at the pump. So oil was about $3 a barrel in 1970. It goes up tenfold in the decade. So that's going to put upward pressure on gas prices and also limit the amount of gas there is. So gas lines, rationing were all part of the 70s. We don't have that quite yet, but we certainly have dramatically increased gas prices, which have gone down slightly, but I think over the winter we're going to see those go up as well. I think a lot of Americans are going to be shocked this winter when they see their oil prices for home heating oil, for natural gas. Those prices are already starting to go up, and I think will continue to go up. And then there was the controversy just recently of President Biden going over or talking to OPEC and asking them to increase the production of oil so that it would lower the gas prices and help in this midterm election. And OPEC, the Saudis, said no, they weren't going to do that. The issue of dependency on foreign oil, right? The oil crisis of the 70s made Americans very aware of their dependency on foreign oil, that we were sort of at the mercy of foreign countries. And this is the beginning of pushes for energy conservation, bringing the speed limit down to 55, concerns that the U.S. would run out of oil. Of course, since then, America has found more sources of oil and natural gas in the United States through fracking and discoveries, and we actually were relatively energy independent up until fairly recently. But this issue of limits, that natural resources are important, and do we have enough natural resources? And then today is complicated by the issues of sort of green energy, moving towards a green economy, and what that means for how we fuel our cars, for how we heat our homes. So let's move away from the economy and look abroad. We have in the 1970s an embarrassing withdrawal from a foreign war. This is the loss of the Vietnam War in 1975. The photo at the bottom shows a U.S. helicopter at the top of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon with Vietnamese, South Vietnamese, basically those that were on our side, supporters of the U.S., trying to escape, trying to get on the helicopter before the communist North get into Saigon. And many of those people did not make it out then. It was a terrible sight and sort of symbolic of American weakness. Remember, America had been victorious in World War II 30 years earlier. It had defeated the Axis powers, and now it had lost the Vietnam War in a kind of an embarrassing withdrawal. And the top is a photo from 2021 of a U.S. helicopter in Kabul, Afghanistan, and that's, I believe, the U.S. Embassy right there. Another embarrassing withdrawal after 20 years in Afghanistan. The U.S. had to basically very hurriedly withdraw before the Taliban came in. There were many Afghani supporters, people who were on our side, who got left behind. It was just an embarrassing way to end 20 years in Afghanistan. The next issue going back home is presidential scandals. Of course, the big one in the 70s was Watergate, Nixon resigning in disgrace. And today we have our own issues of presidential scandals, whether Trump's impeachment, January 6th, issues of Joe Biden and his son, and improper dealings with foreign countries. The point is not to make any partisan points here, one way or the other, but the point is to say that presidential scandals, whether in the 70s or today, are also destabilizing. They, as we will talk about in a second, they make Americans kind of lose faith in their government. And we saw that in the 70s with Watergate, and we're seeing that, I believe, today as well. This loss of faith in institutions went beyond just the presidency. There were hearings in the mid-70s by the Church Committee in Congress to look into the Central Intelligence Agency. And what they found was assassination programs and other things, other covert actions that the CIA had done over the previous 2+ decades. And it shocked Americans. Americans didn't know about this before. What was their government up to? COINTELPRO comes out in the 1970s. This was a FBI program, counterintelligence program, which spied on civil rights leaders, anti-war leaders and groups in the 1960s. All of this made Americans lose faith in the CIA, FBI, and it kind of spurned conspiracy theories. You add to that the assassinations, especially of JFK, but also Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, and then the Warren Commission report on Kennedy, this belief that the government isn't really telling us everything, right? The government is keeping secrets. I'm a big movie fan, and there are a whole slew of 1970s kind of paranoia films which touch on this. The Parallax View with Warren Beatty, where Warren Beatty is a journalist who discovers this this very shadowy assassination group that's assassinating congressmen and others, run by kind of nefarious corporations. 3 Days of the Condor with Robert Redford and Faye Dunaway is about the CIA, and again, the paranoia of being kind of stalked, discovering secrets, and possibly, being killed. All of these films are touch on that element of paranoia. And I think today as well, there are issues about the Central Intelligence Agency, the FBI, and their roles in domestic affairs. So when we talk about loss of faith in institutions, it's really across the board. Here's some statistics. The Pew Research Group asks Americans over time, whether they have trust in government, faith in government. In the 1950s, 3/4 of Americans had faith in government. This is a shocking statistic when I tell my students. They all laugh because none of them trust the government. That goes down by 1980 to 26%. And that's because of Watergate, the loss in Vietnam, the poor economy. All these things are making Americans lose faith in their institutions, especially government. By the mid-'80s, Ronald Reagan comes into office and restores some of that faith in government, but then it tails off by the late 80s. You had Iran-Contra. 1960, notice I put 2001. Notice I put October 2001. Of course, that's right after September 11th. You see a temporary jump in the numbers there because of 9/11. And today, you're down to 20, in 2022, we're down to 20% of Americans who believe that government does what is right always or most of the time. So the numbers are generally down from 1950s. People do not trust their government. They don't trust Congress, the president, the Supreme Court, and they're losing trust in other institutions as well. Some of the issues of the 1970s are cropping up today as well. Abortion, so a key social issue of the 1970s. The Roe v. Wade decision of 1973 was huge. It did not legalize all abortions, but it created a right to abortion that had some limits to it, which then later get expanded. But just establishing the right to an abortion in 1973 was huge. It then spurns a kind of a pro-life movement, which was dedicated to overturning Roe and trying to reduce the number of abortions. And in fact, in recent times, the number of abortions in the country have gone down. And then this year, abortion has now come back even more with the Dobbs decision, which overturns Roe v. Wade. It says there is no constitutional right to an abortion, but it sends the issue of abortion back to individual states. So this is what happened prior to 1973. States like California and New York had liberal abortion laws, and other states had strict abortion laws. Now Dobbs is moving abortion back to the states. So individual states are coming up. Some are banning abortion, some are regulating abortion, others have little to no limits on abortion. But this is proving to be one of the hot button issues in the current midterm election, and I don't think it's sort of completely going away. Another Supreme Court decision from the 70s, which is coming back today, this year, next year, is the issue of affirmative action. In 1978, Alan Bakey, who had applied to medical school at the University of California, had been rejected. And he claimed he was rejected because of affirmative action. That other applicants who were African Americans were admitted with lower scores than he had. And the case goes to the Supreme Court. It's a really convoluted Supreme Court decision. But the takeaway from it is the Supreme Court says Bakey should be admitted to college. He was unfairly rejected. With his scores, he should have been admitted. However, the court said that schools could continue to use race in their admissions decisions. And the reasoning for it was interesting. The only reason or validation the Supreme Court gave for using race was the issue of diversity, was that schools had an obligation to maintain a diverse student body, and that this was a larger social good. So affirmative action then remains legal and continues from the 1970s down to this day. But now we have a new Supreme Court challenge. There are a number of cases, one against Harvard, one against the University of North Carolina, and these are called Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard and UNC. The Supreme Court has agreed to hear them. We'll probably hear the case soon, this fall, and will make their decision in 2023. The issue here deals with Asian students. And the argument is that it's Asian students who are being harmed by this, and that some of these schools have an Asian quota. So that if it was just about test scores, the number of Asian students in these highly competitive schools would be much higher than what they currently have. So this case is going to be the Supreme Court. It's going to deal with using race in making college admissions decisions. And we'll see what the Supreme Court says, how it revisits the Bakke decision. I'm guessing that it's going to make some changes to it and some restrictions on affirmative action. But again, in the 1970s and today, affirmative action remains a hot button issue. Crime is another issue. I'm a New York City historian. Most of what I've written is about New York City. So often I look to things in New York City to kind of tell the larger story. So especially with crime in New York, this is a good place to talk about crime. Crime in the 1960s and 70s was increasing throughout the country. But if you look at New York, you can really see it. You had the infamous Son of Sam killings in the 1970s, David Berkowitz at the bottom. This is something I remember as a child very well. Movies, looking at movies again, Death Wish with Charles Bronson, a kind of the vigilante movie. Bronson is going to go and kill the man who murdered his wife. Because crime was rampant, individuals had to go and take the law into their own hands. Taxi Driver with Robert De Niro is about a kind of a loner, a mentally ill loner who is going to try to assassinate a political candidate. And it shows, if you've never seen Taxi Driver, you should go and watch it. It's a great movie, but it's also a great sort of documentary of New York in the mid-1970s. So it's filmed in the streets, and you can see sort of the chaos that's happening in New York at the time, because crime is dramatically increasing. Murder rates are a good way to look at crime because there's almost always a corpse, right? So the number of murders is relatively is a number that can be agreed upon. For other sometimes robberies, thefts, not everyone will call the police on it. So if you look at murders in New York, there were 482 murders in 1960, more than doubled by 1970, and then it's up to 1,800 by 1980. 1990 will be the peak. It'll be over 2,000 murders a year. To give you a sense, by the 2000s, New York, the murder rate in a much bigger city, there was a larger population, the number of murders were down in the 300s. It's gone up a little bit since then. But crime, personal safety, urban disorder becomes a huge issue in the 60s and 1970s. It helps to fuel the move to suburbia, the white flight, the flight of mostly middle and working class whites out of cities into suburbia. It starts in the 40s and 50s of people going out to the suburbs, but it continues into the 70s, driven by the fear of crime. Here's more New York 1970s, blackouts, looting. This is the South Bronx. You see kind of abandoned buildings, abandoned apartment buildings, rubble. The famous, during the 1977 World Series at Yankee Stadium, Howard Cosell is announcing, and you can see the fires burning beyond Yankee Stadium. The whole nation could see that. Cosell says the Bronx is burning. So another theme from the 1970s is the move to the Sun Belt. Now we call the Sun Belt basically the South across to California, that whole swath from the Carolinas over to California. And what you see in the 1970s is it starts in the 60s and 70s, a shift, a move towards the Sun Belt. One of the things that drives this is the invention of air conditioning now. So you can now live in places like Arizona and South Florida, even in the summertime. And 60s and 70s, more and more people are leaving the Rust Belt, the Midwest, Illinois, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan. They're leaving the Northeast and they're moving down south. There are more jobs, there are more opportunities, taxes are lower, the weather is better generally, and there's also a political aspect to the Sun Belt as well, because for the most part, this area, the Sun Belt, tends to be more conservative. So what you begin to see is now places like California, population increases, the number of electoral votes increases, Texas, Florida, the Midwest, the Northeast, which tend to be Democratic, sees the number of electoral votes decline, their populations decline. So it's not just a shift of people, it's a shift of political power to the South and the West. So think about Republican presidents, Nixon, Reagan, George Bush, coming from the Sun Belt. The Sun Belt, this helps to fuel the rise in Republican politics in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and beyond. Now, today, the shift to the Sun Belt continues, with one exception. People aren't going to California anymore. California is actually seeing an out-migration of people. This is a list of migration since, a net migration since 2019. California is not on there. Rising cost of living in California, especially, has been driving out a lot of people from California. But Florida, Texas, Arizona, especially Florida and Texas, are seeing more and more people moving down there. Some headlines. This is just from last month. New Yorkers continue to stampede south as record numbers swap to Florida licenses. More New Yorkers getting Florida license plates. From 2020, New Yorkers flee to Florida and Texas as mobility surges. Many of this began in 2019, but many of this is also pandemic driven. Right? Places like Texas and Florida tended not to shut down their economies, and their societies tended to remain open much more than in the North. So more people were leaving places like New York. Increase in crime and disorder also affected people. People are still leaving New York. They're going down to Florida, going to Texas, Arizona. If you look at the top 10 cities in America today, I mean, New York is still there, Chicago is still there, Philly, I think, is still hanging on. But you also find places like Phoenix and Dallas and Houston on there as sort of Sunbelt giant metropolises. And I think these areas are only going to continue to grow in the coming years. Going back to foreign affairs, Russia invades. So in 1979, Russia invades one of its neighbors, Afghanistan. And it is although it's a sort of a quick victory, it turns into a quagmire for Russia. As throughout the 1980s, they're fighting a guerrilla war against the Islamic Mujahideen, who are covertly funded by the United States to help defeat the Soviets. And in the 1980s, the Soviets will end up having to evacuate Afghanistan. It was a terrible blow, a terrible defeat for Afghanistan. Some people said Afghanistan was the Russia's Vietnam. And that was one of the many things that sort of helped to kill the Soviet Union. Right? The Soviet Union will dissolve just a few years later. Now we get to 2022, and Russia has again invaded another neighbor, the Ukraine. Again, they face very tough guerrilla opposition from the Ukrainians, who are supplied and supported by the United States and the other Western allies. Just as with Afghanistan, Ukraine is turning out to be a huge embarrassment for Russia. It's showing the glaring weaknesses both in the Russian military and in Russian society. It's still fairly recent in the war. It's been, about 6-8 months. So it's kind of hard to know where things are headed with that. But again, we see the issue of Russia invading a neighbor and the United States and its allies kind of coming to the support, not militarily, not sending troops, but aiding and supporting the insurgents. Then there's a general issue of malaise. Now, whether we're in a period of malaise today, I don't know, but here's the famous speech by Jimmy Carter, July 15th, 1979. He gives it from the Oval Office. He never uses the word malaise. That's a misconception. It's actually called the Crisis of Confidence speech. And it's really an amazing speech by a US president because he's talking about this fundamental threat to American democracy. What is that threat? It's a crisis of confidence. Americans by 1979 are in a crisis of confidence. The economy is bad. Vietnam was a disaster, was a loss. Watergate was a terrible embarrassment. And there's just a feeling that the country just isn't working right? It's a crisis that strikes at the very heart and soul and spirit of our national will. We can see this crisis in the growing doubt about the meaning of our own lives and the loss of unity of purpose for our nation. The erosion of our confidence in the future is threatening to destroy the social and the political fabric of America. It's really an amazing speech, but it hurt Carter at the time, because what you want from a president is, I think, you want optimism. You want to say times might be bad, but we're going to make it out, and here's what we're going to do. And Carter seemed to be kind of suffering from this malaise as well. Now, recently, there's been some revisionism that Carter's speech was actually very brave, that he was telling people to cut down on their consumption, on consumerism, cut back on their energy use, and that's the kind of thing that Americans don't want to hear, but they need to hear. But I do think it was a devastating speech for Carter. It hurt him. It's one of the many things I think hurt him in the 1980 election. Reagan would posit himself as the anti-malaise candidate, the optimistic candidate, the candidate that would promise to bring back America. And Carter was just sort of tagged with this. And for a lot of Americans, this hurt the way they felt about the president. So when we talk about the age of limits, what does it mean? It's the end of, and then we're talking about the 70s now, the end of the post-war optimism, right? It's the era of malaise. Americans were not optimistic about the future. There was also increased political fragmentation and polarization. The culture wars, abortion, feminism, race, all these things sort of starting in the late 60s, 1970s, and continuing down to today. We see a weakening of American military and diplomatic power. It's a limit, right? It's a limit about what America could do. Not only did America win the war in World War II, but for about 2.5 decades, it pursued a policy of containment of the Soviet Union, Soviet communism, rather successfully up until Vietnam. By the 1970s, a lot of Americans said, well, maybe we're not able to do that anymore. Maybe we should just bring the troops home and look inward. We also see in the 1970s the deindustrialization of the American economy. Right? So deindustrialization, the factories, especially in the North and the Midwest, are starting to close down for a variety of reasons. Some of them are moving to the South, some of them are moving abroad, and that deindustrialization really kind of hurts the working class in America. You can start to see from the 1970s onward increases in economic inequality and insecurity. I mean, there's never a perfectly equal time in America where everyone is economically equal. That'll never happen. But the 50s were fairly close time in terms of economic equality. The 70s begin a time of divergence in terms of that. There is also the 1970s, the beginnings of discussions of limited natural resources, right? Maybe we should be cutting down on our consumption and our use of resources. Maybe we're going to run out of oil and other natural resources. And that's added a form of pessimism. What's that going to mean? Is it going to mean that we're going to have less than our parents and grandparents did? That's another element of the age of limits. However, not everything was bad about the 1970s, right? In the 1970s, there was an increasing emphasis on personal freedom and rights. We're talking about sort of civil rights, feminism, gay rights begin in the 1970s. And overall, even for many Americans, the idea of kind of personal expression and liberty becomes a big issue and an important issue. We have expanding opportunities for women and minorities in the 1970s. There was a kind of cultural flourishing underneath the malaise. Disco, which had fans and it had enemies. This is the birth of hip-hop music in the 1970s. It's born in the streets of New York, the streets of the Bronx and Queens during some of the toughest times in New York City. Punk music as well, new age music comes out of the 1970s. And in addition, as I said before, I'm a big movie fan. The 1970s are sort of one of the golden eras of Hollywood. You know, the 30s and the 40s into the 50s is one golden age. The 1970s are another time. You had directors like Martin Scorsese, Francis Ford Coppola, Woody Allen, making great films. And in that period, I think we've not seen a similar period since then. In addition to this sort of cultural flourishing, it's also the beginnings of our new era of technology, especially computing. There's a picture on the right of Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, right? They found Apple. You have Bill Gates and Microsoft. The beginnings of this, of sort of personal computing, of the transition to American society. Slowly, we don't have personal computers. Most people still don't have computers. Computers were still really big at this time. Most computer games, I remember playing Pong, but by the end of the 70s, they're getting a little more complicated. But this is the very beginnings of that period, and a beginning of Silicon Valley and this sort of new economy which will come out of this. So, does history repeat itself? Well, I would say no. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. That's a quote that's sometimes attributed to Mark Twain, it's sometimes attributed to others. I don't think it was Twain who said that. We don't really know who said it, but I think it's a pretty accurate phrase, right? We think that history repeats, and we're always talking about analogies. The Iraq War was just like Vietnam. And no, there were similarities there, but they weren't the same. But history does rhyme, and as we look back to the past, we can find echoes of what we're going through today in the past. And I think with this lecture, hopefully, I've shown that that there are echoes of what is going on today back in the 1970s. So we study history, in part to learn how to deal with the problems of today. That's one thing we do. But we also study history to understand that most things are not new. Right? Yes, we're dealing with inflation now, but we've dealt with inflation in the past. And I think understanding that helps us to grapple with the problems today. History doesn't begin, last year, right? There's a long history of human society, of humans grappling with all kinds of problems. And as we understand how humans dealt with problems in the past, I think it will help us to grapple with our own problems and also to understand that most of what we're dealing with is not new. So there are differences between the 2020s and the 1970s. One of those, obviously, is we're now right in the middle of the digital age with social media and other new technology. This computer technology was all in its infancy in the 70s. But think of how central social media is to much of our country today. I mean, I'm not a big social media person, but so many people are on social media, and it drives so much of our politics and our culture and our everyday interactions with other people. And that's a big difference. Whether it's better or worse, I will leave up to you. Another difference is we're not in the Cold War anymore. And yes, Russia invaded Afghanistan in '79. Russia's invaded Ukraine today, but this is not the Soviet Union. We're not in a massive Cold War. Yes, Russia still has nuclear weapons. There's the fear of nuclear war, but it's very different than the Cold War tensions that were still around in the 70s and 80s. Instead, today, we're talking about the rise of China, which is sort of another big issue. Another difference between the 70s and today is that today's population is much more diverse. We have now a number of decades of high rates of immigration, just changed America very much. 1970, America was still, a small number of immigrants. The immigration law of 65 had just gone into effect. But the issue today of migration and immigration is huge. Issue. That's why border enforcement, you hear a lot about the border and concerns about what's happening at the border is a major issue. And I would argue it's not just an American issue. This is an issue in Europe as well. And I think this will be an important issue throughout much of this century, in fact. Globalization, another thing that was just sort of beginning in the 1970s, is now a huge force. We are a much more globalized economy and society today than we were in the 1970s. And then lastly, there's the effects of the COVID pandemic, which are so unique. There was a flu outbreak in 1968-69 called the Hong Kong flu. It killed somewhere between 30 and 100,000 Americans. It killed a few million worldwide. But it did not have the same impact on society as the COVID pandemic. Many of the things that we're going through right now are in part because of what happened over the last 2 years because of the pandemic. And how we move forward and how we move forward with future pandemics and deal with them is going to be very important for where we go in the country. So what might we learn from the 70s? Well, one thing we're already seeing is that the Federal Reserve is going to raise interest rates in an attempt to squeeze inflation out of the economy. Paul Volcker to the right was the FedSec chairman in the late 70s, early 80s. This was his policy. He was very successful in wringing out inflation and bringing it down to a more manageable rate. But by doing that, by raising rates quickly, which is what the Fed today is doing and will continue to do, I think, it's going to lead to a major recession. And you see from 1979 to 1982 a major recession, largely caused by the attempt to get rid of inflation. And all signs point to the fact that that's going to happen with the Fed today. They're going to squeeze inflation out, and we're going to be headed for a recession. How big of a recession, we don't know. Hopefully it won't be as bad as 79, 82, but there'll definitely be a recession. There's definitely going to be pain, unemployment. That's the trade-off with reducing inflation. Secondly, I think you're going to see a rightward shift in American politics. This is what happened in the 1970s. Ronald Reagan and the Reagan Revolution was a reaction to much of what happened in the 1970s. Now, we have a midterm election coming up. It looks like Republicans will probably win, which often happens. The out party usually wins in the second year when there's a president of a different party. So that's not terribly unusual, but I think many of these issues are going to begin to push American voters a little more to the right. What that means for the future, I don't know, but I think you're going to sort of see that in the coming years. I think you're going to see crime will continue to be a major political issue. This is another thing drawing people to the right. There's a big debate today about incarceration and are we putting too many people in jail? So one group says we're putting too many people in jail. We should not put as many people in. We should be lighter in our punishments of criminals. And there's another side that says, well, if you do that, you're just increasing crime. And you're seeing cities from New York to San Francisco who are dealing with serious problems of crime and disorder. I think these issues will continue as we later into this decade. We're going to keep seeing more political polarization and more culture wars, abortion, affirmative action, gay rights, whatever it may be. We're going to see more of this, which will polarize the American population. And then, of course, the continuing question of America's role in the world. Should America be active militarily? Should we be isolationist? Should we be somewhere in between? The Ukraine issue, there seems to be a lot of support for American policy in the Ukraine so far, but there's also some fear that we don't want to do too much because we really don't want to risk a nuclear war with Russia. No one really wants to see that. So that's the end of our lecture, and thank you for tuning in, and I look forward to taking your questions. Great. Well, we've got some questions now that some of you have provided, and if you have more questions, feel free to send them in. First question is, how much of the loss of faith in the federal government is the result of objective reasons versus intensive and deliberate efforts to bring it about by right-wing media and politicians? Well, remember, when we're talking about loss of faith in government in the 70s, a lot of that was driven by sort of the left, the political left, I would say. It's a reaction against Watergate and other political scandals, reaction against the CIA and the revelations there. Today, I think more of it comes from the right, certainly. But the numbers are so low overall that it can't just be one political persuasion that feels that way. If 25% of only 25% of Americans have faith in government, that's got to be across the board, ideologically and politically. So yeah, but I think there are definitely objective reasons, both in the 70s and today, and there's also ideological reasons that people, drive those fears. But I would say that both in the 70s and today, there's sort of a real basis for it. Although it is kind of depressing to see those numbers. Another question? What do you consider the single most impactful event of the 70s? I think the big ones. I think Watergate, certainly. That was a huge issue because not that there hadn't been scandals before. There was Teapot Dome with Warren Harding. There had been scandals under Truman, but no scandals that really had driven a president out of office. There had been the attempted impeachment of Andrew Johnson after the Civil War. But the fact, not only that Nixon had been driven out of office, but also the publication of Nixon's tapes, I think with the language that was used, that upset a lot of people. People had maybe a naive view of how politics work and how government works. So Watergate, and the other one I think is the loss in Vietnam. I think put those two together, those really had a deep impact on American society and the way Americans viewed their government and their country. Another question says, do you think the factors that drove the increased crime in the 1970s were different than those driving the current increase in crime? Well, you're dealing with an issue here that sociologists, criminologists, historians debate, which is why does crime go up and why does crime go down? And there are many, many reasons why that are given. I would say one thing that is sort of similar between the 60s and 70s and today recently is a kind of a pushback from law enforcement, right? There is a sense now that law enforcement, rightly or wrongly, in the 90s and the early 2000s was too strong and too strict and too unfair. I'm thinking about things like stop and frisk in New York City. I'm thinking now movements towards restricting police, police violence, police brutality, the defund police movement, but even sort of more moderate attempts to hold back police. I think there is a sense that law enforcement itself feels under siege, and they are pulling back. Police are able to kind of modulate how much they enforce the laws based on what the public wants. And I think you saw some of that in the 60s and 70s as well. There are economic reasons for why people commit crime. There are all kinds of reasons. But in that sense, yes, I think we're in a time when people are much more critical of law enforcement, again, rightly or wrongly. And I think that was similar in the 60s and 70s. Another question, empires often collapse because of overreach. Would you say that this applies to the US? Yeah, this is a classic. This is like Paul Kennedy's theory of imperial overreach, whether it's the Roman Empire, the British Empire, and people argued in the wake of Vietnam that America had overreached. Having said that, those feelings kind of, by the 80s and 90s, we had overcome, so to speak, the Vietnam syndrome. And I don't want to say we had rebuilt the empire, but certainly rebuilt the military. America remained active in the world. And then with Iraq and Afghanistan, there's a feeling that maybe we've overreached again. But I don't see a pulling back from that. Possibly long-term, there are economic repercussions. That's part of the argument about imperial overreach. So that might be an issue. But I'm not sure we quite see that yet with America. I think America is still heavily involved in the rest of the world. Maybe not in the sense of being, military incursions throughout the world, but our military is in a lot of places. We have a lot of military bases. We're involved with the Ukraine war. We certainly are, not behind the scenes. So I'm not a full believer in imperial overreach in that sense as it relates to the U.S. yet, but who knows what would happen in the future. Another question, is the extreme polarity in politics in Washington the main driver of loss of trust in government? That's a good question, although you could probably argue it the other way, that extreme polarization makes people more politically active because they feel so strongly about issues, and they're so polarized that they want to sort of defeat the other side so that they're kind of more engaged in government. So I'm not sure it's the main driver for the loss of trust in government. I think it's just simply, it's, accumulate. We just know so much more about, what goes on in Washington. There's greater cynicism in general, I think, about politics today. So I don't think it's necessarily the polarization that's driving the loss of trust. I think it's a cynicism about what goes on in Washington, a cynicism about our so-called elite, whether it's big business or inside the beltway types. Another question: in the 70s, college students were very involved with protests versus government. Not today. Why? Well, that's kind of interesting. I wonder. It's another. I mean, college students are very involved, politically engaged today. I think they're engaged in kind of different things, right? They tend to be engaged in environmental issues. They are engaged in racial justice issues. They're not engaged. They're not. The anti-war issue is kind of an interesting one because you don't see as much of that. You saw some during the Iraq War, certainly, but you're right. You don't see sort of directly protesting government actions. It's much more sort of issues-based and ideological based. But certainly college students are very active today as well. Another question asks, was there greater generational strife in the 70s than today? I mean, I think, the 60s and 70s certainly brought along great generational strife. The idea never trust anyone over the age of 30 was something that young people had often said. And then once they became 30, they kind of wondered about that, the truth of that. But yeah, I don't think there's as much generational strife as there is today. There are issues between the generations, right? We use these shorthand. We use the boomers, the Generation X, the millennials, the Generation Z, or millennia. So we talk about that, and there are tensions there between those. There's a whole movement, the OK Boomer movement. There's, older people who are criticizing millennials for being whatever, lazy or so forth. There's that kind of tension that we see, but I don't think it's necessarily parents versus children directly, which was a lot of the 1960s and 70s. Do you think we were as politically divided in the 1970s as we are now? It seems like the two political parties were not as ideologically divided in the 70s. Now, that's certainly true. In the 60s, and up to the 60s and 70s, you still had liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats. What we've seen over the last 40 or 50 years is kind of a sorting out of the two parties along ideological lines. It used to be parties were divided ideologically, but also geographically, also by class basis. The Democrats were the working class party. The Republicans tended to be more the business party. But now the parties, really since the 70s and 80s, have increasingly sorted themselves out ideologically. So there are very, very few liberal Republicans, and there are very, very few conservative Democrats. And there are, also few moderate Democrats and few moderate Republicans. So in that sense, yes, we see the beginnings of that in the 60s and 70s, but it's really gotten much more stark in our own time. The last question here, we have a couple more questions. To what degree might the increasing complexity of our system contribute to decreasing confidence? Citizens see the government system as too complex to deal with. I actually think there's a lot of truth to that our society gets increasingly more and more complex. Our government, corporations, societies become much more bureaucratic. I think that's something that's certainly true. And the more bureaucratic or complex a system gets, the more difficult it is for an individual to navigate that. And I think that's certainly true. I think it's much easier. You have more faith in government when you can, reach out to your congressperson or reach out to your mayor, and you can, or city council or whatever. You have more access. As they become more remote, and as just everything becomes more complex, I think that's certainly an element to it. Another person asks, do you think the availability of guns and rifles helped increase crime? So honestly, I would probably say no. And the reason for that is you can chart the rise in gun ownership of the last 50 years, let's say, and it really has gone up and up and up. And the crime rate has sort of gone up and then down and back up. Certainly, there are a lot of guns out on the street. A lot of them are illegal guns. A lot of them are in the hands of gang members and so forth, and that's an issue. But gun ownership has tremendously increased, and even during the period of very low crime from the 90s down to 2010 or so. So as guns increased during that period, we saw crime go down. So I don't think that's necessarily a direct link. All right, well, thank you all for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed the lecture. A lot to think about here. And again, thank you for joining me. I hope you enjoyed it.